You are listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And so we are joined today by a particularly interesting individual, somebody who has had a consequential voice in American public and intellectual life on matters related to race and society and all sorts of subjects that I hope we get a chance to pursue here in this conversation. I am joined today by Shelby Steele. Shelby is an author, documentarian, and I've got to read this part, a Robert J. and Marion E. Oster Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Most recently, he is the author of the book Shame, How America's Past Sins Have Polarized Our Country, and alongside his son, filmmaker Eli Steele, is the mind behind the documentary What Killed Michael Brown, which I look forward to our talking a little bit about here today. Mr. Steele, did I miss anything you'd like to add to that introduction, or is there anything you need to correct?
No, that doesn't.
Okay, very good, very good. Yes, well, I am. First of all, I'm excited to have this conversation because I think that you are somebody who has a long reputation for intellectual courage. You have demonstrated that very recently, you and Eli, in being willing to produce a cinematic work, a documentary work that explored the death of Michael Brown, a young man killed by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. That'll be remembered by everybody listening to this podcast. In the documentary, you sort of come to, I think, a certain conclusion about what led to the death of Michael Brown. That is, I think, perhaps not in step with the way a lot of folks would like to think about that case. And it is the conclusion you come to is something that extends from a larger critical narrative that you articulate in this documentary that seeks to sort of analyze the liberal status quo surrounding how we think about race in America, and attributes to that really sort of the cause of the death of Michael Brown. That this was not simply a racist act by a racist police officer. I'd like to ask you to sort of explain what it is the documentary tells us, and after that, I'll follow up with a point or two to dig into more detail.
Okay, that sounds fine. Well, our concern, what drew us to the case originally is that Michael Brown was shot and killed on a given Saturday afternoon in August of 2014. Instantly, in the community surrounding it, Ferguson and so forth, there was a narrative began to emerge, which essentially was that Michael was a victim of white racism, and that this was yet one more example of how police in America, policing in America was a detriment, a danger to Black youth, particularly young Black males. This then in turn proved the argument that racism in America doesn't just happen in isolated moments, but is systemic.
Right.
It's there universally, ubiquitously, ever present, ever a danger to Black youth. And that, again, this then adds to the even larger argument that victimization continues to be the fate of Black people in America. Well, as we began to look into the case, right away we sensed this was a political polarizing narrative, that this was not in fact the case. Right away we began to find that there were at least two different grand jury reports, there were two Justice Department investigations, an FBI investigation, and all of this investigating, not a single shred of evidence was ever turned up to indicate that the shooting had anything at all to do with racism. It's simply that it was a tragedy. There is no doubt. A young life was lost. But when you actually look at the details of the case, there's no way in the world to prove uh, that had to do with racism. And so the reality conflicts with this story of Black victimization in America.
Mm.
Well, my sense, take responsibility for it myself. My
Mm.
sense is that this since the '60s has come to be a way that we function as Blacks in America. That we have told a narrative in surrounding any number of different incidents that make us into victims, because this gives us leverage with white America. We can then go to white America and say, look, you're still racist, you still owe us.
Mm.
And so it's a way that we can enlarge the entitlement that we feel is due us given our history
Mm.
in America. And so again, we wanted to see all of that in this incident, in this particular case. Thousands and thousands of people descended on Ferguson because they sensed the power in that narrative, in that what I call poetic truth, that
Mm.
Blacks are still victims of racism. If you can get close to that, if you have evidence of that, you then in America, because America is interested in redeeming itself from its racist past.
Mm.
If you have evidence that it's still racist, you have power.
Mm.
You can affect American institutions. You can affect the society on a broad level. You can change the curriculum in public schools in America. You can change the rules of release from prison. You can do all sorts of things in American society. So it's not an idle fight. The problem is victimization motivated by racism still a problem for Blacks in America?
Mm. So
My
that.
argument is that it is not.
Mm. Okay.
That the organized oppression of Black people in the United States of America is essentially over with,
Mm.
effectively over with. Are there incidents of racism? Absolutely. There have always been, there always will be, probably. But have we come to a place where we're now free and able to move into society and pursue our own lives, and obviously in contrast to what we were able to do before, segregation and so on? Are we free? I think we are.
Mm. So I do want to engage that central claim here, right? Because it really does, I think, deliver us to the crux of the disagreement that we see playing out in America within and beyond the Black community. This question of, is racism on the one hand something that animates all of the obstacles in the face of Black progress, not just historically, but contemporaneously? Or on the other hand, is this really sort of a relic of the past that we are, as a serious structural obstacle to Black progress that some of us are now using, white and Black, as a means towards political influence and power? I want to get into the meat of that controversy, but I do want to pull a little bit more. I do want to tug at a narrative thread in the documentary here, because I think that it does go to illustrate some of the larger pattern that you're articulating here. Attorney General Eric Holder plays an interesting. He's an interesting character in the documentary. And one of the, by the way, I just watched the documentary from beginning to end yesterday. I will tell everybody listening that just as a cinematic work of art, this is just a beautifully produced produce peace. And one thing that I guess you and I and maybe Eli have in common is that we must all be jazz guys, because the soundtrack to the soundtrack to the documentary, yeah, is just wonderful. It's just great jazz all the way through. So
Thank you, thank you. We take pride in it.
there you go. We'll have some jazz conversations as we go. I promise. But Eric Holder, interestingly, he is introduced as sort of riding in on a bit of a white horse. It seems from the federal government as the controversy in Ferguson, well, as it explodes into outrage, the aftermath of the shooting of Michael Brown. And Holder, in the way at least it is shown in the documentary, seems to want to speak to people's sort of race-based anger, outrage at the racism of the system. He seems to personally identify with the protesters on an identity level. But then a little bit later, Justice Department report seems to, Holder's Justice Department seems to exonerate, does I suppose exonerate Darren Wilson, and yet the narrative from Attorney General Holder evolves in a way to where the focus becomes from the Justice Department less on this particular incident of the shooting of Michael Brown, but rather on the idea that there's a larger systemic racism problem that is operating in the city of Ferguson, which then itself in the documentary goes on to seemingly be contradicted by some residents in the city. Can you just take us through that whole part of the saga, Eric Holder's role, and what his actions seem to suggest to you in terms of how it may highlight the troubling patterns of liberalism and race that you are more broadly criticizing in your remarks here in this interview?
Yes, it's one of the things that we found more interesting. Here you have the shooting of a black teenager in the remote suburb of St. Louis. And almost immediately, the president of the United States is involved and is making comments about it, and very quickly decides to send his attorney general, Eric Holder, to Ferguson to investigate the situation. And so here comes into this little suburb the attorney general of the United States of America to examine this event, interview people, and but right away when he comes in, he gets off the plane and he says, "Attorney General, but I'm here as a black man," clearly making a statement that he had a partisan interest. He had something above just whether or not the law was applied fairly. Right. He was here really, in a sense, as an advocate for black power in a way. And he was here at the behest of President Obama. Would they have sent the President of the United States, the Attorney General of the United States, would they have been interested in this case if it had been two blacks who shot each other? Well, we think not. In Chicago, thousands of blacks were killed that same year on the South Side, shot and killed. I think the number is somewhere 652 were actually killed, 3,000 were shot. President of the United States said nothing. There was very little national coverage, and of course those numbers, as we now know, are familiar with, go up every year. Well, the white trigger finger that pulled the trigger that killed Michael Brown shot a black teenager. So you had, in a sense, an echo of America's history of racial oppression. And that then again outlined a certain power, opened the door to power, because America now wanted to make up for that, wanted to heal from its long past. So Holder and Obama, as we say, they went to Ferguson looking for victims and looking for racism. And that formula, those two things, constitute, we think, Black power in America.
Hmm.
We didn't create the computer industry. We didn't create the automobile industry. We didn't do certain other things, but we were victims of 4 centuries of oppression.
Hmm.
And we are determined there is a power in that now that the larger society recognizes its wrongdoing. And that power, Black power, is what Eric Holder was after. And so right away, Holder began to look at the pattern of police ticketing Blacks very high rates. This, despite the fact when we looked into that issue, we discovered that one of the reasons that Blacks were ticketed at this high rate is because the whole area surrounding Ferguson is largely Black.
Hmm.
Black people are the people who are on the roads driving. The reality, of course, again, is that in Ferguson itself, the police officer who gave the most tickets was himself Black.
Hmm.
So again, the myth of Black victimization is that's what the competition is. That's what the power is over, and so Eric Holder, in a sense, embodied that corruption, that the federal government was involving itself, was trying to engineer, define a situation, an incident, tragic, and it's simply an incident, a killing, as the pretext for Black power in America today.
Hmm.
And of course, other events, the Trayvon Martin shooting, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Eric Garner in New York, all of these incidents were used again to underscore this idea of systemic racism, which is the basis for Black power in the United States.
And one
This is the irony.
Mm-hmm.
Without the racism, there's no power.
Mm-hmm.
There's no race, there's no power attached to the race. We need that racism. And so ironically, the people who suffered from racism for 4 centuries now have a vested interest in identifying with that victimization.
Mm.
It has now, in a sense, evolved into an enormous source of power for Black America.
Mm. And I want to head off one assumption that some folks listening with the critical ear might have, which is that perhaps you are dismissing the legitimate outrage surrounding a number of these cases. In the documentary, you obviously it centers around a sort of, a rejecting of the general narrative surrounding what took place between Michael Brown and Darren Wilson. But you also comment later on the fact that you, in observing the death of George Floyd, saw that as an sort of an unadulterated horror and abuse of power on the part of that police officer. And I imagine that there are probably instances where we see these deaths taking place where perhaps in some cases you think they're more complicated than what meets the eye, but maybe in other cases you think, no, this is about as bad as it looks. Am I right in that? It seems like the constant thread that you're identifying is not the idea that there's no outrage to be had in all these cases, but rather there's this predictable pattern of political exploitation of these events on the basis of leveraging Black victimhood for political gains. That's the overarching societal pattern that you seem to be criticizing, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Indeed.
I think we certainly don't argue that racism doesn't occur, that it doesn't exist in America. It does exist. Wherever there are human beings, it exists. It's a deep, racism is a human reflex. Excuse me.
Quite all right.
And so it's always, it's going to be present in American life in one form or another, probably for a very long time. We hope not. We hope it will be neutralized. But our argument is that when you pursue Black power through your own victimization, as the victimization of your own group, that's self-destructive.
Mm.
Because you then have to, and this is one of the things we try to explore, you then have to create and engineer a Black identity that is grounded in the idea that we're victims.
Mm-hmm.
You have to accept and believe in your victimization as an individual human being.
Mm.
I'm Black, so I'm a victim.
Right.
And we are the ones who lose. We're the ones who then pay the price for that. And when you see people like what Eric Holder is doing and so forth, I'm sure he doesn't realize that he really is advocating an identity. So if you want to be Black, you have to acknowledge victimization.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say I'm free, I'm not a victim, you're a little bit of an Uncle Tom. You're betraying the group identity. Mm-hmm. And so there is this pressure there to identify with what makes you vulnerable, with what makes you weak. Victims they're not in charge of their own fate. They're not in charge of their own life. Mm. They live at the behest of the oppressor.
Right.
And when you shape the world in that way, you lose. The world doesn't, but you do. And this is one of the dilemmas, we think, of contemporary Black America.
So then I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between racism and power. And I did actually prepare a little thing here. I want to read to you 3 different quotes from 3 very influential African-American thinkers today. The first one reads, race is the child of racism, not the father. The second one reads, from the beginning, to make races was to make racial hierarchy. And the third one reads, we human beings never use race except as a means to power. Race is never an end, it is always a means, and it has no role in human affairs except as a corruption. The first quote there is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Race is not the child of racism, it is the father. The second is from Ibram X. Kendi. From the beginning, to make race is to make racial hierarchy, to suggest that the reason we have race is because people were trying to derive power from it. And the third is from yourself, that we only as human beings we don't use race except as a means to power. A person could listen to those 3 statements and think, okay, these sort of fall within a bit of a set, right? And yet, won't come as any surprise to anybody who's tracking these conversations to know that I think you likely would see yourself as having some deep disagreements with folks like Coates and Kendi. But what I want to sort of seize upon is the fact that, there are, folks in the Black community and folks who are activists and maybe Black nationalists of different varieties and whatnot who do see some innate kind of, significance to race. Obviously, they're white folks like that too, of course. What the anti-racist orthodoxy seems to say is that race is a social construct. It was something that was invented by people who wanted to use it to gain power over other people. On the surface, you seem to be saying something, at least rhetorically, sort of similar in that one line that I seized upon there. But where the narratives seem to diverge is that within anti-racism, the idea seems to be we need to hold tighter to these racial distinctions, not because they are objectively true, but because they have so defined our social reality that we cannot meaningfully engage the obstacles towards true human equality or equity without observing distinctions on the basis of race. I think that many African Americans, I think many folks would probably look at you and certainly other folks like my friend Thomas Chatterton Williams and a lot of folks is saying that, no, that's the exact opposite instinct. We need to transcend these racial categories if we are going to free ourselves of the prejudices that have locked us into our state of futility.
All these guys that you're talking about
Mm.
pursue power
Okay.
by keeping race alive.
Okay. And that's my question. What is it about that instinct, you know, to keep
It's the
race
same
alive?
instinct that they themselves are critical of.
Mm,
They're using race as a means to power,
mm,
and using race as a means to power. They may understand the underlying dynamic
mm,
of human beings creating a category of race and then using it and so forth. Then it's exactly what they turn out what they do.
mm,
Is to say, well, this is why we come up with a new rationalization. This is why we have to keep it alive, because it's been there so long and it's dominated and oppressed so many people and so forth. And in order to deal with that, we have to keep race alive.
mm,
No, you don't. If you're really bold, if you're really courageous, you don't keep a corruption alive. It's a corruption. It's a corruption when you use it. It's a corruption when the Ku Klux Klan use it. It's a corruption. There's no way you can make it a good thing.
mm,
Race is not a race is a thing we have been. It is the biggest threat to our democracy that we've ever had, probably ever will have.
mm,
It's a profound, almost inconceivable evil
mm,
because it's so insidious and it plays so much on the dark side of human nature.
mm,
It gives that those impulses in us a means to affect the world. So it's not something that you can dance around or figure out a rationalization to keep it alive. It is evil. It's as simple as that, and it should be resisted.
mm.
Uh, Listen, we can be a little corny about it. The best phrase that was ever written with regard to race is Martin Luther King's not the color but the content of our character.
Mm,
Well, we're still struggling with that ethic, the content of our character as opposed to the color of our skin. The color of our skin, you follow that and give meaning to that, give power to that, you're going to move into darkness.
mm,
We have to pursue to make our virtue is in the content of our character.
right.
I'm responsible. My name is Shelby Steele. I'm responsible for Shelby Steele, not my race.
Mm,
My race is whatever I do with it, but it's not what motivates me. I'm an individual.
mm,
Well, part of the problem I think that a lot of these younger writers have is that they really want a Black identity.
mm,
They really can't let that go. They can't put that in jeopardy.
mm.
And when their thinking sort of takes them to that place, they come to a wall. They just stop and they start going back the other way and figuring out how they can keep race alive, how they can rationalize
Yeah.
the evil.
Hmm.
But then they join the company of the people they say they hate, the Klan, the white supremacists, the people who've all throughout history used race
Mm.
as an evil.
Now, I'd like to seize upon that point for a second and use it as an opportunity to pull a bit from your own experience. First of all, and I haven't yet read the book that you wrote about Barack Obama, but I do seem to recall reading that you said made sort of a similar analysis of Obama in saying that part of what held Obama back, I think, correct me if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, but I think that you said something along the lines of part of what holds Obama back is the fact that he perhaps coming from a multicultural background is searching for a Black identity to sort of to anchor himself in. perhaps is for inner psychological reasons, but it has a relationship to his politics and in seeking to anchor himself in that black identity. It perhaps narrowed his vision or his understanding of what some of the larger problems were facing the black community. I'm sure that's a clumsy paraphrase, but do you want to clarify any aspect of that? Are you saying were you saying something similar about Obama in your analysis of him?
Thinking back to
That
that.
book, I guess, was a little while ago. Well,
uh,
the reason I brought it up is because I'm a biracial person. My father is white from the South originally. My mother is black, and I certainly this point about identity is a meaningful one to me because I can think of times in my own life and in my own upbringing where it felt as if I needed to sort of reach further into an identification with who I am as, as a black man in order to more fully understand who I am in the context of the world. Now, there are many dynamics to that, for me personally, and it would take too much time to go through, the depth of my personal experience. But I think that part of what we tend to have an attraction to, and Kendi is a few years older than I am. I'm not sure how old Coates is, but I think that for so many of us, though, we look back at the history of the Black freedom tradition, the Civil Rights movement, and part of what not just young African Americans, but I think many people around the world and in this country perceive is a striving towards the greater realization of justice and equality from an engine of perhaps a certain degree of cultural solidarity, right? Within which what we term the black experience finds itself kind of molded by fire and defined in some sense. You're a veteran of the civil rights movement. You have a pedigree, a distinct pedigree in that part of our history, which I know is the backdrop to so much of what you talk about. Um, I guess my question to you here is one, I would love to have you uh, uh, explain a little bit as to what that pedigree is, because I'd want for folks listening to this conversation to know where you come from in that. But two, was there a difference in the movement in terms of how black people related to their own blackness, so to speak, or to the idea of race, perhaps better said, that is maybe misunderstood today? Because I think a lot of folks look at the civil rights movement and said, "Hey, these are black people uh, coming together as black people to do something that benefited everybody." But at the heart of it, you had a black movement. I think a lot of people carry that narrative in a certain direction that's different from where you've taken it and maybe how you experienced it at the time. So I want to know, what was the significance of race back then, and talk about your role in that movement,
Well,
your
it's
experience.
a good question.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, it's not true
Mm-hmm.
that movement was certainly blacks were at the forefront of it, but that was an integrated movement.
Mm-hmm.
There were thousands and thousands of white kids,
Right.
college kids who, you
Right.
know, come down every summer from the north and beating right with the Freedom Riders and so forth. So on every single level of the civil rights movement was white. There was a white presence.
Mm-hmm.
There was no in that movement itself. They were very very clear. This was not a racial. This was not a racial. What would you call it? Campaign.
Mm-hmm.
It was a human campaign, and the integration proved that it was not racial. They did not believe in the idea of race as some sort of atavistic truth that you conform to.
Mm-hmm.
They sensed race as a danger. They were fighting against the use of race as a means to power.
Mm-hmm.
They detested it, and so that's. I come from a biracial background too, though My parents met in the early 40s in the civil. They were founding members of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality,
Right.
in Chicago. I grew up in the movement. There were my family was involved in, as far as I was concerned as a kid, too much. I was made to march too many times, too many different situations. Every Saturday and Sunday we'd have to get a picket sign and go somewhere and protest, because the world was extremely segregated at that point in time. So there were no lack of targets.
Talk about your extracurricular activities. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember in the 60s when Black Power sort of began to happen, Stokely Carmichael and so forth. I can remember a conversation I had with my father, who was born in the South, third grade education and so forth. And he said to me, "What is this word? What do they mean? What do you mean identity? What is that?" Well, if anybody had an identity as a black person, it would have been my father.
Mm-hmm.
He had no idea, nor did anybody else really know what it was. Well, it emerged as a political concept around race, as using it as a means to power. We now see today identity is taken over the left wing in the United States of America as a meaningful truth that justifies the pursuit of power. It's still with us. It plagues us. Now it's the left, the liberals who, tell somebody you don't agree with affirmative action, preferential treatment for blacks. You'll have on the left, you'll have a fight in your hands. Race is okay when we're using it for what we want.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the evil of the perniciousness of race, is that it is, and the original civil rights movement, God bless them, understood that. The challenge in particularly a democratic society like our own is to be able to relate as humans, and not to qualify that with race. Once you do that, you are entering into a territory of evil. The end of that is that one race dominates another race, and it exploits them, and whatever makes a convenience of them, as we say in the film. And so the ironies are rich, but it was because we came in the 60s, we won the civil rights movement, we became free, we moved out into the mainstream, and the minute we got there, we had no experience with freedom. We had experience with everything but that. Right. Freedom is frightening because suddenly you're responsible for your life. Well, we have been suffering from that fear, that anxiety, that nervousness around freedom, the level of responsibility it imposes on us. And so what have we done? Rather than face into that and move through that period in our development, what we've done is reach out and grab race again. Blackness, whatever in God's name that is. I was born in the 40s. There was no blackness. No one knew what that meant. I lived in a totally black world. Well, point is again, we use race covers over always a low motive. The motive for us using race today is that it protects us from the anxiety of freedom. The demands that freedom places on us, the expectations that freedom, well, you wanted freedom for 4 centuries, now you got it. What are you doing with it?
Right.
And it's our fate historically to be cast in that position. So I see a lot of these younger writers. It kind of makes me sad. You can't go back and invent some gobbledygook postmodern idea you're just trying to keep race alive. You want race, and you need to be honest. You want it in your heart. You think it really does mean something. You want to make something of it. You want it to be something. You want it to give you something. It will never do any of those things. That was the genius of the Martin Luther King civil rights era.
Right.
It will never do anything for you.
So I do want to pursue this point on freedom, and I want to pursue it in the context of this particular question of systemic racism. But if you wouldn't mind me bookmarking that for just a second, I want to throw a quick aside at you. Is there a meaningful distinction to be made here between race and culture and the value therein? And I'll preface that by saying this. I have a friend, actually, I'll mention him by name just because he's been featured in Braver Angels events in the past. My friend Derek Steele, who's the leader of, or he's a leader of the Social Justice Learning Institute in Los Angeles. And in my conversations with him and a lot of other folks like him, we talk about the Black community, and we talk about the disappearance in certain cases, and this is sort of happening in parts of LA, where historically Black communities that had certain cultural anchors and traditions, and music, food, and all sorts of different things are starting to sort of give way through all sorts of things: economic dislocation, gentrification, immigration. You sort of take your pick. And there are a lot of folks out there who, for whom it is important, the idea of a Black community and Black communities. They feel that there is value to be preserved in there. And the word, Black is kind of what is emphasized, but within Black, it seems that there is some identification with cultural traditions and experiences that, inform our sense of perhaps ourselves and how we move through life. Do you see any worth or value in Black culture in that way, that in some sense might lend something, I guess, to be sympathetic with when people talk about the importance of Blackness? Because I imagine that at least part of it has to be just an overlapping with the idea that there's cultural value to be retained. And of course, people inform their identities in so many respects in the context of the culture that they love and experience.
Yeah.
What's the relationship there?
That's a good question. But the culture is a different thing than race.
Mm.
The reason we have a Black culture is because white supremacy conquered us, used us as slaves, forced us together on the basis of our race.
Right.
So anytime people are together for any length of time, a culture will evolve.
Right.
Black culture inevitably evolved out of slavery, out of segregation. Now we're struggling with freedom, though we don't always admit it. We want to escape from it and say that systemic racism is everywhere. No, freedom is everywhere, and that's what we're nervous about. But again, the culture, I have studied Black culture all my life. I've taught it. I've written about it. I am, my tastes in life and in music and food and everything, no one who knows me would doubt this, are Black. What we would think of as Black culture come out of the Black world. I give you a lot of examples, but the point is that those things are that much of my sense of culture comes from the Black American experience.
Right.
I wouldn't trade it for anything. I think I'm the luckiest man in the world for having been born Black, for having been born into a situation where I could be exposed in a sort of elemental level to that culture.
Amen.
Which defines me. On the other hand, I realize that culture is an ever evolving thing.
Right.
When I look at the world my kids are raised in, now I have grandkids, there's no way that the Black culture that I grew up in is available anymore to them. They're gonna live. The world's gonna be different. They're going to be more assimilated into the mainstream. Well, that's wonderful.
Mhm.
I've been fighting for that level of freedom for forever.
Mhm.
That's wonderful. But again, culture changes, it evolves. They will make their contribution to it. And then the subsequent generations and so forth, race will disappear at some point in history.
Mm.
Once without oppression, you can't enforce it.
Mm.
People will cross racial lines in a minute.
Mm.
People will become intimate friends in a minute. There will be intermarriage. There will be interracial relationships of every kind. Culture will chase behind it, keep up with it.
Mm.
That's the human condition. So the idea that my sense of blackness, and this is what bothers me about this, my sense of blackness is sacred, and that I have to fight to preserve it, is
Mm.
ridiculous. It's not going to wait for me to fight. That's a good way to make yourself irrelevant.
Mm.
I'm trying to keep up with it. The possibilities.
Mm.
One thing that is amazing to me again today is the matter of freedom.
Mm.
My father never grew up in this kind of freedom. There was no black response to freedom because there wasn't any. Well, my generation has had a great deal more, and we're different. We're more assimilated into the American mainstream than blacks used to be in the past.
Right.
What's that mean for our culture? It's not that it's going to be diluted. That's the big anxiety. It's not that it's going to be diluted. It's going to evolve. It's going to change. Will it survive forevermore? God knows. But it's not to worry about. It is to be aware of the danger of making a truth out of race. That's the danger. There's no truth in it. There's no truth in it.
Well, and so that takes us to this point of at least nominal agreement between yourself and the anti-racist constituency, because there is this idea that there's no truth to it. And yet, to take us to the subject of systemic racism, what folks like Kendi and Coates and many others would argue is that the fiction of race has created a reality of social stratification in American life that has been enforced by our institutions, is not just historically, but even up to the current moment. And the interesting thing about what you might think of as what some people would think of as certainly as the elasticity of the definition of racism as it has kind of traveled across time is that it allows for in this way of understanding racism, it allows for racism to be a functioning catalyst for oppression in a society, even when the people operating in an institution do not consciously bear any ill will towards folks on the basis of color. So it seems like the definitions we're in a war over definition, I think, at this moment. Language has become polarized in a way to where we're using the same words in the same conversations and yet maybe spinning our wheels because we're just defining them in radically different ways. But I do want to ask if there's a kernel of truth to what it is folks on the anti-racist side are saying here. Because part of what you, I think, you talk about a couple of points of history in the documentary. I may have heard you talk about these things elsewhere as well. Many Black conservatives will talk about the pernicious, or at least the negative impact of the war on poverty, the Great Society programs, welfare as it was executed, at least starting with Lyndon Johnson and going onward. A lot of folks will talk about the impact of those programs on family formation in the black community, de legitimizing the role of the father in the home, drawing a connection between that and the uptick in out of wedlock births, poverty, and so forth. You also talk a bit in the documentary about the crack cocaine epidemic. I think you talk a bit about it in the context of the erecting and then the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects in Philadelphia. And one thing I didn't hear mentioned in the documentary, although it's possible that I just missed it, is the war on drugs that preceded that many people look at as kind of just sort of an epitome of the structural obstacles that Black people have faced in this country, because even up until relatively recently, or even the current day, you've had sentencing disparities between crack and powder. Cocaine, you've had Black people arrested for recreational drug use at significantly higher rates than whites, even though polling suggests that rates of usage are generally the same. My question is whether you're looking at the impact of the welfare state, so to speak, on the Black community, whether you're looking at the war on drugs, whether you're looking at the educational system or any other host of programs, policies in American life. Is there not some justification to the sense that people have that just on a system level, things are set up in American life in a way that is prejudiced against the social advancement of African Americans, which makes this freedom question one that you have to take in the context of all of these sort of misfiring policies that may be coming at us, from whatever directions. So I know that was a big loaded question, but I toss it to you for you to do with what you will, Mr. Steele.
I'll let it go that way.
Sure.
No, I think I hope I understand what you're asking, and I think that's again, to be just very blunt,
Mm-hmm.
that's rationalization. We've never been in these institutions before. Segregation and so forth kept us out.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take us a little while to learn how to really function in them. It's going to take us a little while to learn how to function in freedom. My point is, that's where we need to be focusing our attention. Mm-hmm. What I see us doing is going off, and focusing on protest. Mm-hmm. And once again casting this idea that we're victims, that racism is so subtle, such an insidious thing, that now we're oppressed, by statues. Mm-hmm. We have to tear the statues down. Ooh. Sometimes age is helpful. When I look back at the life my father was born in 1900, mm-hmm. in the South, third grade education, no more, in the fields. Mother and father dead by the time he was 14, on his own. And your people are telling me today they have to have safe spaces on their campus, mm-hmm. in order to. Are you kidding me? When did Black people get that weak? When did we get that pathetic? Do we have to have the world has to? When do we get that spoiled? Mm. Well, in many ways, liberalism has spoiled us. It's given us so much of this garbage that we think is our doing, and so we sit there and conjure up all these elaborate ideas about how we're still victimized. And we just cling, number one, above all else, we cling to that idea that you think victimization is dead. Victimization is all over the place. Everywhere I go, it's there. I know it's there. I can see it. When I see that, I say, whoever is like that and talks like that is afraid of his life. Doesn't know what to do with it. Afraid to commit himself to it. Afraid to get down and start at the bottom and work his way up and master skills and ideas and talents and compete in the larger world with everybody. and give up this silly idea that is racist victimization it's never gonna happen. Grow up. Really, grow up. Let me see you face freedom. Let me see you make something of yourself. Let me see you raise children. You know how difficult it is to raise children?
I do. I've got 3.
Well, then you know. That takes a good bit of your whole consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And thank God you face up to that. How are we going to compensate if you don't? Then all the whole world collapses, and we run into all the kind of stuff, crack, the drug problem, all the sort of problems that we have to a higher degree than almost any other group, crime, levels of crime and so forth. That we again now say is systemic. Well, you know, you could the rest of the world is looking at us and sort of saying, when are they going to get really hip and understand that their own delusions are their biggest problems? Their profound need to hang on to victimization as though it was something beautiful, as though it was their real secret essence, and that they're proud of it, and that they will find a way to keep it. They will find an argument to make that keeps it alive. They will never sever themselves from it. If they do that, they might end up like me. I'm trying to. I've got work to do. I've got work to do. I have to sever myself from that. There are no excuses. I've tried all excuses. I'm in the same boat as everybody else is in. I've tried all the excuses, all the wonderful, interesting postmodern ideas. My profession is an English professor for you. I know all that stuff. It's it's a delusion. It's takes me down paths in life that go nowhere, that help no one. I'm an American citizen, and one of my answers to all of these dilemmas is I've got a national identity. My race is my business. Government has nothing to do with it, nothing to say about it, and nor does anybody else. It's my business. I owe everybody in my country my loyalty as a citizen, my support as a citizen, my affection, my love for my country. God knows I've traveled a lot, traveled to Africa a good bit. I can tell you that in Africa, people have said to me many times they wish their ancestors had been captured as slaves so they could grow up as Americans. America is a marvel, unbelievably great society. People from all over the world want to get here. We should be just grabbing this freedom, exploiting the openness. And the world is open to anything we come up with now, anything we want to do, anything we want to be. For us to be back in the corner over here, gnarling over some idea of anti-racism, whatever that may be, it's heartbreaking to me. Face the real challenge. The real challenge: make something of yourself. Join America. Don't resist. Don't keep calling America racist. One of the untold greatnesses of America is that in 50, 60 years, since the 1960s, this country has made more moral progress than any country in human history, by far. I grew up in segregation. I know the progress America's made. It's unbelievable. Racism is now considered the number one evil in American history. When I was growing up, it was good manners. It was custom. Well, look at the difference. I can't absorb. I don't have enough time to exploit all the freedom open to me now. It's just everywhere. But it makes me have to be more responsible.
Mm.
I have no excuses. If I don't succeed now, I can't say racism is stopping me. It's because of other normal things. Maybe I want to open a business and I haven't really paid enough attention to my business plan.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Again, the real challenges that we as blacks face now, um, we have to stand up to freedom. Here's my big word with regard to this whole business.
Mm-hmm.
My big word is acceptance. The challenge for Black America right now is to accept our freedom.
Mm-hmm.
We got it. We won it.
Well, let
In
me.
1964, they passed the Civil Rights Bill,
Mhm.
voting rights, housing, everything. We got it.
Let me see if there may not, and I'm conscious of our time, but let me see if I may not be able to introduce just a certain nuance into this, because on the one hand, there's deep resonance with me for so much of what you're saying, in part because my experience in the United States of America has been thoroughly blessed. I feel my freedom every day, you know, and that's something that I'm very grateful for. I grew up in I mentioned a biracial home, but I grew up in a multicultural, middle class suburban area. It was, well integrated, new people from all over. Had my own identity issues, but they didn't define my life in a negative way. I was well cared for, well loved in my community, and believing in the American dream was sort of an automatic for me. I tell people I grew up thinking of myself as actively living in Dr. King's promised land, ultimately. Because for me, reality was just like that growing up. But I've got a story that I tell about me and my wife and our relative experiences in the riots in 1992, in the aftermath of the beating of Rodney King. And when I was 5 years old, that's how old I was at the time. When the riots took place, it was just the faintest backdrop for me. I knew something strange was going on in the air. My parents were nervous. I saw a clip or two on the news. One day, my mother pulled out of the driveway to go to work. My father stepped out the door after her. He came back in the house. He had a crestfallen look on his face, and later he told me, he said, "I was thinking to myself, God, I may never see her again. Why did I let her go?" Because the violence wasn't throughout our city, but in certain places, like at the Foxhills Mall in Culver City, not far from where my mother worked, there was looting, there was burning, and she got close to it, but she came home, she was fine. 15 miles away in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts, where my wife comes from, at the age of 4 years old, she was literally living in a war zone. Gunshots, fires, law enforcement retreating. She saw gruesome things in that period of time just from her window, and over the course of her life living in the projects. I mean, she's probably seen more people die than some folks who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, over the course of life there. And if you rewind it, I mean, she's a person who lived in the Jordan Downs projects. I know people who live in that area, or I've met people who've never been to the beach in Santa Monica, just 20 miles away or whatnot. You look at the surrounding school systems, and, that's not where you go frequently, those areas, if you want to find a public school education that is on par with what you'd want. But if you rewind back in the 80s and the 70s, you have, the crack cocaine epidemic, you have the war on drugs, you have the ways in which relationships between the community and law enforcement soured. You go back before that, we already talked about the welfare programs, the Great Society, the assassinations of civil rights leaders, and all of the unrest of the 60s. In the cultural memory of a black person, even living today in 2020, who comes from that environment and is rewinding backwards, right? Who, maybe whose parents or relatives didn't move into the integrated communities after Jim Crow was lifted, who didn't go into the universities, who didn't go to Hollywood, who didn't go into sort of an integrated suburban neighborhood, people who remained locked in the urban centers that were already, struggling even before the war on drugs and the Great Society and all that. it's hard for, I think, in my experience, it's hard for a lot of folks in that circumstance to be able to hear the idea that they're free, you know, and not think of it as a bit of a cruel joke. You know, it's like Dr. King said, it's well and good to tell a man to lift himself up by his bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say that to a man who has no boots. A lot of folks look at themselves as having no boots because they look in the rearview mirror and this is all America has seemed to be to them. And so for
Mhm.
me, I sometimes feel as if I try to be sensitive to the fact that we talk about blackness, we talk about the black experience and so forth. They're clearly different black experiences, I think. You know, it doesn't mean that everything you're saying isn't ultimately right, but I just wonder if you find any cause to kind of reckon with the diversity of sort of, you know, streams of the black experience when sharing your message, because I can, you know, person like myself can hear a lot of things and say, hey, that jives with my experience, but it's hard for me to be too judgmental of somebody who says my black experience has been a whole heck of a lot different and so is my parents, so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering, how do you ever find cause to engage those differences?
Oh, sure. I thought about all those things for a long time. You say, and I think correctly so, when you live a life in the inner city, you're not going to look up and say, "Oh my God, you know, they tell me I'm free, but look at this,
Mm-hmm.
what I'm surrounded with, and so forth."
Right.
That does not dispel the truth, the reality that you're still free,
Mm-hmm.
whether you like it or whether you know it. Maybe you don't know it. Maybe you truly, in your body, believe that you're not free, that racism is still everywhere. Otherwise, you wouldn't be living in these unfortunate situations. The inner city with all of uh, its malignant problems, its terrible problems, and that this is proof of your victimization and so forth. Well, you're still free.
Mm-hmm.
You're free to get out of here. The key to it is that you have to take responsibility for that yourself. If you're waiting for a movement to come, it'll never come.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the biggest thing that 60 years of American liberalism has done is, and for blacks, is kill off the idea of self-help. Self-help as the ticket to ride, the way ahead. You know, there were many great leaders, Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X,
Mm-hmm.
particularly, who focused a great deal. Self-help as the answer.
Yeah.
Well, I'm of that company. I'm of that group. I truly understand self-help is the everything else is an illusion. And because I've written a lot about white guilt, because American society has this problem with guilt, and it's profound, and it drives them to take over our problems for us
Mm-hmm.
and reinforce our sense of helplessness. To build public housing for us. Let us find a way to get some housing, to build it ourselves. Fine, let's leave us alone.
Mm-hmm.
Let us do that. When you keep doing that, you reinforce helplessness, and that's what's happened now for 60 years in Black America. So the family's gone. The Black underclass grows by the minute because we've killed off the idea. We think self-help is an extension of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
To go to a poor black man and tell him self-help is his ticket to ride is abusive, is mean, it's judgmental. Well, that's the dilemma we're caught in. It's hard to do that. It's difficult. It's because America has not yet found the courage to be honest with the people it once oppressed. And say, yes, we did oppress you, we're ashamed of that, and so forth. But the reality is, you will never be paid off with entitlements at the level in which you suffer.
Mm-hmm.
You will never be compensated for that suffering. So when you run around, you use the word justice every 5 minutes. Hey, you're never going to get it. It's a delusion. It's a way you deceive yourself.
Hmm.
It's a way you feel, you indulge, the way you feel bad about yourself, the way you rationalize not being responsible for yourself. These are extremely hard messages,
Hmm.
extremely painful. And people like you and I don't feel, my God, I may see this truth, but I don't have what it takes to state it, to look a black person in the eye who's poor and say it's on you.
Hmm.
But reality will say exactly that.
Hmm.
And will hold black people accountable to exactly that. And you will get in this world about as far as you take yourself.
Hmm. Indeed. Well, Mr. Steele, it has been a pleasure. And
Oh, no,
an honor, I'd
pleasure.
like to say. No. It really has been. And I hope that we can continue this conversation again down the line, because I do feel like these philosophical and cultural currents are moving in America. The question is, are we going the direction we want to go or not? But and we're speaking to folks who are left, right, and center right now. And I think the thing for everybody to appreciate is the fact that you have staked out a certain ground on the basis of years and decades of both study and experience, by way of which you come to convictions that are well earned. And so we didn't get a chance to talk about all of the different things I wanted to talk about. Wanted to get a little bit into political polarization and all that. Hopefully, the fact that there's more to discuss means that you might consider joining us again sometime.
I'd be happy to. This was a good interview. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you. And so, for everybody who's watching and who's interested in getting involved with and supporting the work of Braver Angels, find us at braverangels.org. Become a member, join a Braver Angels Alliance in your community, like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Whether you're left or right, black or white, we are building a house united. Until next time, thank you, folks.